the idea of toilet paper as we know it has only really existed for a couple hundred years. But the first commercial toilet paper was made in 1857 by a man named Joseph Gayeti, and it was said to have medical benefits, and it was even watermarked with his name because he wanted his name in that place. They didn't sell very well, and this was either because people were doing fine with their old newspapers and corn cobs. Remember, Granddad's going to stick to the cob, or because they were embarrassed to buy something in the store to wipe their butts with. And it was probably the second one more than the first one. Because if you think about it, if you've been using newspapers and corn cobs for your whole life, and so did your grandparents, then nobody has any experience buying toilet paper. You know what I mean? It's not something that you know how to do. Imagine if you've never bought deli at a deli counter. You don't know how it works, right? You always buy your deli from the freezer section, or you just don't eat deli meat, right? So it's the same concept of like, A, how do I do it? B, this is a kind of something I maybe don't want to talk about. You know, it was considered unmentionable. It was considered part of the unmentionable category for a long time, actually. Scott Tissues is one of the first companies that ends up dabbling in commercial toilet paper and having a bit of any bit of success. And this happens when Clarence and Edward Scott create the Scott Paper Company in 1879 in Philadelphia. And they actually didn't make toilet paper when they first started. What they would do is buy paper in bulk and then perforate the sheets and sell basically, you know, a certain amount of sheets to different like third parties. And that's kind of how they got into the toilet paper business. And they sold them to places like hotels and drugstores. And this elevated the status of toilet paper from some sort of like gutter tool and unmentionable to a level of class because one could obtain it while staying at a hotel. And everyone knows the things you get at hotels are always cooler than what you have at home. I mean, it's kind of paraphrasing, but it is a lot like that. The fact that you would go on holiday or whatever, and you come from your house and your outhouse and your Cobb and your Sears catalog, and you get to this hotel and everything's clean and nice, and you go in the bathroom, it's like, oh, they have toilet paper. Like, what? That's cool. That's comfortable. You know what I mean? And then you go back home and like, man, I wish I could have some of that hotel stuff at my house. And that is kind of one of the things that really brings about the need and demand for regular toilet paper that we have today. The surge in indoor plumbing as well is also what drives that boom. There are companies like Charmin and Quilted Northern that come on the market later on, and toilet paper would begin on the road that is still on today, which is and it basically comes from that mixture of the two things of people go from using the bathroom outside, which I think even if you're outside, it almost makes more sense. Not makes more sense, but it's understandable that you would use a corncob pipe or not a corncob pipe. I hope you don't use a pipe. Like a corn cob, you know, an old piece of cob, or like a piece of newspaper. But it's like once you bring that business inside the house, you almost have to like step it up a little bit, you know. And so it's like you bring it inside, and also you mix it with the nice places you go in society already are kind of having that, you know, when you're using the bathroom. It's basically the perfect storm that creates that white roll of paper that you have in your bathroom right now. And that is how toilet paper happened. And now it's time for the roundup. The roundup. The roundup. And we're going to round it up. People start wiping with anything they can find, which includes leaves, moss, and coconut fibers. The ancient Greeks used pieces of pottery to scrape themselves, and the Romans used sponges on a stick. The Chinese give us toilet paper, and actually they give us regular paper as well. The colonial people had more than one use for the corn plant. Remember, stick to the cob. And regular toilet paper as we know it begins in 1857, but doesn't take off until around the turn of the century. Things I didn't know before. And now I know them. Never heard of these things. What are they? All right. Things that I didn't know before, which like normally is a lot. I didn't put the Chucky stick on here because I figured we mentioned it enough earlier, but that's definitely something that I did not know. The idea of scraping as opposed to wiping is also a new idea to me, but we'll get to the ones I have written down. More than 7 billion rolls of toilet paper are sold annually in America. Did not know that. Sounds about right though, because when you go in those big box stores, man, they just have that stuff just piled high, just like you know the size of, it's like almost like Like if you go in Costco, they have them stacked up to like the size of like a 2-story building. Another one, it wasn't until the 1970s when American media could begin to refer to toilet paper as toilet paper. Basically, before that, it was bathroom tissue, and this has a lot to do with what we were talking about before, with the fact that it was an unmentionable, something you don't talk about. So you can't. Are we gonna say toilet on the air? And have people think of toilet. People using the bathroom or stuff like that. So they called it bathroom tissue instead of that. I just thought that. I never knew that because I grew up. I'm post 70s, so it's always been toilet paper. But the idea that it wasn't always that, and people were not afraid, but the FCC was like, you can't use that. It was up there on the same level as like any sort of like sexual innuendos and like cursing. And last, but certainly not least, the average American uses 57 squares of toilet paper a day. Now that sounds like a lot. And so your homework for this week is to count your squares, people. When you're at work in the bathroom, when you're at home in the bathroom, when you're in that dank porta potty that's got that blue goo in there, count your squares and report back and let me know how many you're using. I already know I'm using more than 57. When they said that, I was like, oh, I'm definitely part of like the higher part of that spectrum. I'm a folder. I fold. I guess you can put that in the comments too, how you handle that business. But yeah, that is it for things I didn't know before. All right. That's been another episode of How Did That Happen? I always appreciate you guys stopping by and pressing play. Definitely have another episode lined up for you next week. Like, rate, and subscribe where you can. I appreciate you. See you next week.